One afternoon after the meeting, Thomas invited Margaret for coffee at a small cafe near the library. Margaret was hesitant at first, but she finally agreed. In the cozy cafe, they continued their conversation, this time about memories of their deceased partner. "Margaret, have you ever thought that love only comes once in a lifetime?" Thomas asked, his eyes serious. Margaret was silent for a moment, then softly replied, "I used to think so. But now, I'm not so sure. Margaret, I must confess that I haven't felt this way in years. Meeting you is like a miracle, something I didn't think I would experience at my age." After her conversation with Thomas, Margaret returned home, her heart filled with unnamed emotions. For the first time, she wondered, does loving someone new really mean betraying the dead? Or is it just her way of punishing herself for feeling guilty? One evening, Margaret sat in front of their wedding photo. She whispered, "James, I don't know what I'm doing. You've always been the only love of my life. But I feel so lonely. I want to find joy again. But does that mean I'm betraying you?" Before I delve into the heart of this story, I want to take a moment to invite you to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Your support truly means the world to us and fuels our passion for sharing these intimate stories. If you connect with our content, please leave a comment. Every interaction helps us foster a stronger community, and for that, I am incredibly grateful. Stay until the end to fully experience the characters' emotions and the surprising twist. Margaret, 70, sat by the living room window, looking out at the small front garden. Outside, the white daisies she tended every day were blooming, but she felt no joy at seeing them. The quiet of the house was almost overwhelming. She had gotten used to this in the 10 years since her husband, James, died of a sudden heart attack. James's departure left a huge void in Margaret's soul, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never fill it. "James, I try, but sometimes I can't get over this loneliness," she whispered to the wedding photo of the two of them on the table. In the photo, James smiled brightly, holding Margaret's hand tightly. Looking at the photo, she felt as if he was still there, watching over her every day. Yet one morning, while sitting in the kitchen with a cup of hot tea, the phone rang. It was her only daughter, Emily. Despite loving her mother dearly, Emily lived in another city, busy with her work and her own small family. "Mom, do you think you should join a club or something?" Emily asked over the phone. "I think you need to socialize more. Staying at home like this isn't good for you." Margaret sighed. She wasn't sure if she wanted to participate in social activities anymore. But at Emily's urging, she agreed to try joining a book club near her house. A few days later, Margaret walked into the local library, where the book club met weekly. The small room was filled with tall bookshelves, and the atmosphere was quiet, but warm. In the corner, a group of older people were sitting around a round table, talking about their favorite books. "Hello, I'm Linda, the host of this book club. Are you new?" A silver-haired woman with a gentle smile walked up to Margaret. Margaret nodded. "Yes, I'm Margaret. This is my first time in a book club." Linda led her to sit with the group. Margaret quickly realized that everyone there was friendly and welcoming. Among them, an older man sat directly across from her, his eyes calm and thoughtful. He smiled when he saw Margaret looking at him. "I'm Thomas," he introduced himself. "What kind of books do you like?" Margaret hesitated. "I usually read classic novels, but I haven't been reading much lately." Thomas nodded. "Me too. But I believe that good books have a way of bringing back good memories." His words made Margaret feel a strange connection. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was dealing with a stranger. After the club meeting, Margaret was about to leave when Thomas approached her. "Margaret, if you don't mind, could I walk with you for a while? I live nearby." Margaret was surprised, but she smiled and nodded. They talked more on the way home. Thomas told her that he had been a widower for 15 years. "She was my world," he said, his eyes filled with nostalgia. "When she passed away, I thought I would never be happy again. But life has a way of surprising you." Margaret was silent, but Thomas's words seemed to hit home. She had also thought that her life had stopped after James left, that nothing could make her happy anymore. But the sincerity in Thomas's words made her feel lighter. A few weeks later, Margaret and Thomas began to talk more at the book club. They often sat next to each other, sharing their opinions on books and sometimes personal stories. Margaret felt like she had found a true companion, someone who could understand the pain of loss and loneliness she had endured for the past 10 years. One afternoon after the meeting, Thomas invited Margaret for coffee at a small cafe near the library. Margaret was hesitant at first, but she finally agreed. In the cozy cafe, they continued their conversation, this time about memories of their deceased partner. "Margaret, have you ever thought that love only comes once in a lifetime?" Thomas asked, his eyes serious. Margaret was silent for a moment, then softly replied, "I used to think so. But now, I'm not so sure." Her answer made Thomas smile. "Me too. Maybe our first love is irreplaceable. But sometimes, we can find a different kind of love, not the same as before, but just as precious." Returning home from coffee with Thomas, Margaret felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She missed James more than ever, but at the same time, she felt a new glimmer of hope when she thought of Thomas. She stood in front of James's wedding photo and whispered, "James, would you blame me if I tried to find happiness again?" She knew that if she continued to see Thomas, their relationship could develop further. But at the same time, she feared that doing so would tarnish the memory of James, the man she had always considered the only love of her life. Since that first coffee date, Margaret and Thomas began to see each other more often, not only at the book club, but sometimes they would walk in the park together, or sit over a cup of tea after an afternoon of reading. Margaret found that Thomas's presence made her feel relieved and at peace. He was not only a friendly companion, but also someone who listened to stories she had never dared to tell anyone else. One late afternoon, as the sunset painted the sky a brilliant orange, Thomas and Margaret sat on a park bench. He said softly, "Margaret, I must confess that I haven't felt this way in years. Meeting you is like a miracle, something I didn't think I would experience at my age." Margaret looked at him, her heart beating faster, but also heavier. She sensed something different in Thomas's words, as if he were moving beyond mere friendship. She smiled, but didn't answer, because she didn't know what to say. She had feelings for Thomas. There was no denying it. But at the same time, she felt like she was entering a forbidden zone. Every time Margaret thought of Thomas, a warm feeling spread through her, but at the same time, the image of James appeared. Memories of her late husband flooded her mind. The evenings they spent watching movies together, the trips to the countryside, and the promise that they would be together forever. One evening, Margaret sat in front of their wedding photo. She whispered, "James, I don't know what I'm doing. You've always been the only love of my life. But I feel so lonely. I want to find joy again. But does that mean I'm betraying you?" There was no answer from James, only the dim light from the table lamp reflecting on the picture frame, making Margaret feel as if she herself could not find clarity in her heart. One morning, Margaret's daughter Emily came to visit her mother. Seeing her mother happier than usual, Emily asked, "Mom, what happened that made you look so happy? Did you meet someone at the book club?" Margaret hesitated, but then decided to share. She told Emily about Thomas, about their emotional conversations and how he made her feel less alone. Emily smiled, but also asked, "Do you feel guilty toward Dad?" Margaret was silent for a moment. "I don't know. Part of me feels like James would understand, but part of me is afraid that this means I'm forgetting what you and Dad had." Emily took Margaret's hand, her voice gentle. "Mom, Dad wouldn't want you to live alone forever. Dad loves you. And I believe that what he wants most is for you to be happy. If that man makes you happy, I think you deserve it." Emily's words comforted Margaret, but they didn't ease her conflict. One evening, after the book club ended, Thomas offered to take Margaret home. On the way, he suddenly stopped in front of her house, his eyes filled with emotion. "Margaret, I know this may be too soon, but I want you to know that I really feel something special for you. I don't know if you feel it, but I can't hide it anymore." Margaret was stunned, even though she knew that Thomas cared about her. Hearing these words, she felt everything became clearer and more complicated. She said softly, "Thomas, I really like you, but I'm not sure I can go any further. James, he's still a very big part of my life." Thomas nodded, his voice low. "I understand, Margaret. I don't want to replace James, but I want you to know that if you're ready, I'll always be here." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Thomas's words echoed in her head. He didn't want to replace James, but did allowing herself to love another mean that she was abandoning her dead husband? She stood up and went to the cupboard where she kept James's mementos. In a small box, she found the letters James had written to her, full of love and promises. Reading them, Margaret's tears rolled down. She felt like she was standing between two paths, one leading to the past with James, and the other to the present with Thomas. The next morning, as the sun was rising, Margaret decided to see Thomas. She needed to talk, needed to explain what was going on in her heart. When she reached the park where they often met, Margaret saw Thomas sitting on a bench, waiting for her. She sat down next to him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thomas, I don't know where to begin, but I want you to know that I feel guilty. Not just towards James, but towards myself. I'm afraid that if I let myself go any further, I'll forget what James and I had." Thomas looked at Margaret, his eyes gentle but firm. "Margaret, I don't think loving me means you have to forget James. I believe that love doesn't have to replace each other. I don't want to erase your past. I just want to be a part of your present." Thomas's words made Margaret think. For the first time, she wondered, does loving someone new really mean betraying the dead? Or is it just her way of punishing herself for feeling guilty? After her conversation with Thomas in the park, Margaret returned home, her heart filled with unnamed emotions. She sat quietly by the window, looking at the white daisies she had tended for many years. These flowers had been her and James's pride, a symbol of their love and care for each other. But now, when she thought of Thomas, she felt like she was walking down an unfamiliar path, where she did not know what was waiting for her. Margaret tried to avoid seeing Thomas in the following weeks. She stopped going to the book club, citing poor health whenever Linda, the club's leader, called to check on her. Margaret thought that this silence would help her find answers to her inner conflicts, but in fact, it only made her feel more alone. One day, while Margaret was tending the small garden in front of her house, the doorbell rang. Standing at the door was Thomas, holding a small bouquet of flowers. He smiled, his eyes as gentle as ever. "Margaret, I'm sorry for coming without warning, but I think we need to talk." Margaret hesitated, but she invited him in. They sat in the living room, where Margaret and James's wedding photo still stood as the centerpiece. Thomas looked at the photo, then turned to Margaret. I don't want to pressure you, Margaret, but I need you to understand that I'm not trying to replace James. I just want to be a part of your life, a part that I hope can bring joy to both of us." Margaret was silent, her hands clasped tightly on her knees. "Thomas, I appreciate what you've done for me, and I can't deny that I feel special for you, but every time I think about taking things further, I feel like I'm betraying James." Thomas nodded, his voice low. "I understand, Margaret, and I don't want you to feel that way, but I also want you to know that you deserve to be happy, even if it's not the happiness you had with James." That evening, Margaret called Emily. It wasn't the first time Margaret had shared with her daughter about Thomas, but this time, she wanted to hear a more objective perspective. "Emily, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Part of me feels like I'm living again, but part of me is afraid that if I go any further with Thomas, I'll lose something sacred that your father and I once had." Emily was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Mom, I don't think you have to choose between keeping Dad's memory and allowing yourself to be happy. Dad always wanted you to be happy, and I believe he would never blame you if you opened your heart to someone new." Emily's words made Margaret feel better, but she knew that the final decision was still hers to make. One day, Margaret decided to visit James's grave. She brought a bouquet of white daisies, James's favorite flower. Standing in front of the tombstone, Margaret felt as if she were talking to James, the husband she had loved all her life. "James, I don't know what you would think if you knew I was seeing Thomas, but I need to tell you that I have never stopped loving you. You have always been a part of me, a part that no one could replace. But James, I was so lonely, and Thomas, he made me feel like I could live again." The wind blew gently, stirring the branches around them. Margaret felt as if James was listening, and a sense of peace crept into her heart. A few days later, Margaret arranged to meet Thomas at a small cafe near the library. When he arrived, she smiled, a confident smile she had not had in a long time. "Thomas," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I have thought a lot about this. I can't forget James, and I don't want to. But I can't deny that I feel happy when I'm with you. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to try. I want to give us a chance." Thomas smiled, his eyes shining with a happiness he hadn't felt in years. "Margaret, thank you. I promise that I will never do anything that will make you regret this decision." The story ends with Margaret and Thomas walking out of the cafe, walking together in the sunset. Margaret doesn't know what the future holds, but for the first time in years, she feels like she's living, not just existing. On the way back, she stops by a flower shop, picks up a bouquet of white chrysanthemums to take home. As she places the bouquet on the table next to James's wedding photo, she says softly, "James, I haven't forgotten you, but I think I can find a new way to live that still keeps you in my heart." Does loving someone new mean betraying your old love? What would you do if you were Margaret? Open your heart to a new love or hold on to the memories of your ex? Leave a comment if you want to hear the next